All right, get started here. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Homeline Executive Director Eric Hauge, and we're joined by Homeline Managing Attorney and Hotline Director Mike Graw. And you're joining us on Thursday, July 9th at 1:30 in the afternoon for another one of our weekly series of webinars where we discuss and answer questions related to the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on renter and tenant-landlord relationships. Just a reminder about who we are. Homeline's a statewide nonprofit organization. Our main program that's been in operation since '92 is a free and confidential hotline that renters can contact via phone or email and receive free and confidential legal advice in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong. And like I mentioned, we've been doing these webinars every week, 2 of them a week since about mid-April on Wednesday afternoons for an audience of tenants and advocates, service providers, and then Thursday afternoons, like today, for an audience of landlords and property managers. And next week, we're going to do things a little bit differently. We are going to just have one session on Wednesday afternoon. It'll be 90 minutes, a little bit longer, and we have a guest speaker that will be joining us to discuss a little bit about what's going on in the courts. So 4th District Court Referee, Housing Court Referee, Melissa Hotelling is going to be joining us to share a little bit about what's the 4th Judicial District, which is Hennepin County, how the court is planning to handle cases once the courts reopen. And we'll be, going through the regular presentation like we do most weeks, but also having the referee discuss what's going on and answer questions and whatnot. So with that, I'll pass it over to Mike if you want to share any more about that. And again, reminder, we did get some questions. We always like questions on these webinars. We did get some submitted, just a couple submitted in advance. If you do have any questions that come up throughout the presentation or any other questions you have, feel free to submit them via the Q&A box or over the chat. We'll get to them at the end.
Right, and I will mention a couple things about Referee Hotelling's presentation next week. As Eric mentioned, this is different for us. We've always done them Wednesday and Thursday. This is just going to be on Wednesday of next week. So that's the one chance for you to hear directly from the referee and ask your questions directly. Your best chance to get a question answered will be to submit it in advance. We had 2 or 3 questions submitted in advance today. I have 20 to 30 minutes of material lined up to talk about at the beginning, but we're going to reserve the last half hour for sure for your questions today. So please, if you have them, submit them either in the Q&A or in the chat box, and we will be happy to try to answer whatever we can. We are very excited about next week's session. Referee Hotelling, I don't know when she started actually as the housing court referee. It was sometime this year, but I'm not sure how much before the COVID-19 transformation of the court system occurred before she was actually sitting on the bench. And so we'll talk to her about what was before, what she has been doing for the last few months, and what she will be doing going forward as basically the lead housing court referee in Hennepin County. So we're excited to have her talk to us. She will obviously only be talking about Hennepin County's approach to evictions going forward and other housing court cases. But that is the largest housing court volume-wise in the state. And so how Hennepin County's housing court goes, it's fair to say that the rest of the state at least looks to them for guidance on how to operate their own courts. So it'll be an important session, one we're very much looking forward to and grateful that she's going to be joining us for next Wednesday. No speech next Thursday. For those of you that have been tuning in faithfully every week, we appreciate that, but we will not have a speech next Thursday, only next Wednesday. Okay, so let's have our standard recap of where we are with the Minnesota federal limits on evictions. We're going to start with the Minnesota moratorium. Where we are officially today is the governor's peacetime emergency declaration expires on July 13th. So that would be 4 days from now, so I guess Monday. These have been issued on 30-day increments since mid-March. So in March, the governor issued his first executive order declaring a peacetime emergency, and then it was renewed again in April and in May, and then in June, and we have the one that's expiring in July. The eviction ban is not part of the peacetime emergency declaration. There's a different executive order that creates the eviction ban, but the eviction moratorium or ban is tied in time to the peacetime emergency declaration. So it's critical in that sense that the peacetime emergency declaration is what we talk about when we're talking about when can evictions be filed again. There are, of course, other housing court cases that can be filed. Rent escrows, for instance, is one that tenants file against landlords. Those have started to re-emerge depending on which county you're in, that tenants may or may not be able to file those, but evictions themselves are specifically prohibited, as are any attempts by landlord to terminate a tenancy during the peacetime emergency declaration. There are some exceptions to this. If the tenant endangers the safety of others on the premises, or they violate a specific statute that has a list of things a tenant can't do, have illegal drugs, illegal guns, prostitution, or possess stolen property or domestic abuse within the premises, then those could be grounds for an eviction. But other than that, and that's a small number, relatively speaking, to the number of evictions filed in Minnesota every year. But they do exist. Landlords sometimes file evictions for that. And there have been a handful of evictions filed throughout the state for those issues. And they are allowed under the governor's order. But most evictions, so well over 90% of evictions in Minnesota, are filed for non-payment of rent. And those are not allowed to be filed still until July 13th. So when will the eviction ban in the state be lifted is a question we get from tenants all the time. When we talk to landlords, we hear that same question from landlords. The short answer is we don't know. Under the rules, the peacetime emergency declaration statute that the governor has relied upon to assert this PED, peacetime emergency declaration, this can be renewed probably perpetually unless and until one of two things happens. Either the governor stops renewing these peacetime emergency declarations, or the legislature votes to end the peacetime emergency declaration, the state legislature. Here, both chambers of the state government would have to vote to end the declaration, the emergency declaration. So the last time there was a vote on this was in mid-June. At that point, when the governor declared a peacetime emergency declaration, a special session was automatically triggered, which is what happens under the statute, the peacetime emergency declaration statute. Special session was automatically triggered because the legislature was not already in session. This was the first time, the June renewal was the first time that had happened, where the renewal had occurred during a time when the legislature wasn't in session. So the special session was called. The state Senate, controlled by the Republican Party, voted to end the peacetime emergency declaration. The state House voted not to. Both chambers have to vote to end the peacetime emergency declaration. So it's either the governor ending it or the legislature ending it are really the only two ways under the statute that peacetime emergency declaration can end. And at present, the eviction moratorium is tied to the peacetime emergency declaration. I say at present, that's been the case since both of those were in existence in mid-March. I guess there's a chance that the governor could always say, I'm going to take away the eviction moratorium, but still keep the peacetime emergency declaration in place. There's other reasons for having a peacetime emergency declaration. It's not just about evictions. I know it might seem like that's the only thing that really pertains here when landlords and tenants are talking about it, but that's not the only benefit by having a peacetime emergency declaration in place. That's the state question about evictions. The federal question remains in place as well. So again, if we sort of rewind to the beginning of the entire pandemic when things were being shut down and we got the first governor's order, pretty soon thereafter, the CARES Act was passed. Now, the CARES Act is not just about landlord-tenant relations, of course. It's got hundreds of pages and it talks about a lot of different other things. But it does talk about housing and evictions specifically. And it said that a landlord was not allowed to file an eviction until July 25th of this year. Now, back in March, that seemed like an extraordinarily long time in the future for the government to essentially stop landlords from being able to file an eviction. And we were all wondering, okay, what happens if the state lifts the moratorium before the federal prohibition ends? Now we're getting much closer to that, obviously. The state moratorium ends officially on July 13th. The federal one ends officially on July 25th. But we're almost lined up with that time. Now, the CARES Act prohibition on evictions does not apply to all rental property. It has a specific list of places that are covered. Well, it doesn't have a list of addresses, but it describes what they are. Wherever there's a federal subsidy involved, the umbrella that most of the people in my line of work use is if VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act, covers this type of housing, then it's covered by the CARES Act, which is a pretty broad umbrella. If there's any kind of federal subsidy, it pretty much covers that. Plus, any landlord that has a mortgage that is federally backed. This is a lot harder to know the answer to that question, whether there's a federally backed mortgage. And evictions are really pretty quick court cases as court cases go. And so what we've seen in other states where the eviction doors are open already, either they were never closed or they've reopened, is that most of those states, we've seen Supreme Courts or other entities require that the landlord either provide proof that they're not covered by the CARES Act when they file an eviction, or at least swear under oath that they're not covered by the CARES Act. In either case, the landlord is seen as the party that can figure it out, because the landlord is the one that has the mortgage. They're the customer at the bank. So they can go to the bank where they got their mortgage and say, hey, I'm one of your customers. I need to find out some more detail about this mortgage. Is Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac involved or not? And the bank can answer that question. A tenant is unlikely to be able to get that answer from a bank quickly enough in an eviction case. I assume it's discoverable eventually. It's not the kind of thing that we've ever really thought about much before this year, but it would take time. And in the eviction process, that kind of discovery is rarely enough time to satisfy that question if it came up. So it's probably going to be up to the landlord, although we haven't seen an official statement from the Supreme Court in Minnesota saying that that's going to be a requirement. But so far, we don't have the eviction doors open on the state level. So, by the way, the CARES Act only prohibits evictions for non-payment of rent. The Minnesota moratorium is for everything except endangering the safety of others and the list of reasons that I gave earlier for why a landlord is allowed to file an eviction currently. Now, is that peacetime emergency declaration going to be renewed? I mean, we're only 4 days away. And the first 2 times that this was renewed by the governor, a unilateral decision by the governor, the first 2 times it was renewed, like I said, the legislature was in session at those times. And at those times, the governor waited until the last day. In fact, one of the times it was the last evening. It was 6 o'clock at night. Governor announced, I'm extending the peacetime emergency declaration. Last month in June, the governor gave a couple days heads up because of the special session part. Right now, the legislature is not in session until the governor calls this peacetime emergency declaration extension. But the governor has been giving some very clear direction, at least in the media, that it looks like he's planning to call a special session concurrent with the peacetime emergency extension. So I guess what we're sensing from all of this is that the governor is giving more heads up to the legislature in advance. It seems like the peacetime emergency declaration looks like it's going to be extended. Now that can end at any second. Again, the governor can decide to pull back on this. The legislature, if they do form a special session because there's another renewal, can end this immediately as well. There could be a negotiated agreement between the legislature and the governor. I imagine it would not be just about this. There are a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of money on the table that's being decided where it's being spent, and there's a host of other issues that have come up since COVID-19 was the front page item in mid-March. Obviously, the George Floyd situation has added more legislative possibilities to what might be covered at a special session. So will there be a deal in place? I don't know. I don't know that anybody knows that definitively right now. I think there's some people that have some seats of power that could probably forecast whether there's a better chance this special session to get some sort of deal made or not. But at present, all we can say for sure is that on July 13th, the governor has the power to extend this and the legislature has the power to end it. But we don't know what will happen next. Obviously, next week on Wednesday, we'll be talking about whatever the new status is of the peacetime emergency declaration. But there's a chance that it's going to be going on. One last thing I'll point out from this page is that under the CARES Act, there is a 30-day notice requirement. Okay, so what happens if we get past July 25th, but the CARES Act is still in place? The state moratorium is still in place after July 25th. The landlord, if they're covered by the CARES Act, would still have to give a 30-day notice, which is above and beyond what landlords generally have to do in Minnesota. Now, once again, just a quick description of who's in power at the federal level. That was a Republican-controlled Senate, Democrat-controlled House, and the President Trump, who's a Republican. They're the ones that came up with that rule, that 30-day notice. Just to be fair, most states have some type of notice requirement. 30 days is pretty long, but that wouldn't have been out of place in a lot of states. Minnesota has no notice requirement at present. It's been something kicked around at the legislature for a few years, but there's been no real action taken in that direction. But that 30-day notice requirement would be a new wrinkle for any landlord thinking about filing an eviction. They still might have CARES Act concerns with when they decide that they want to be able to file an eviction once the Minnesota door is open and that moratorium is lifted. Okay, Eric, thanks. Go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so a couple weeks ago, we did a session where we talked about predicting the wave of evictions. And that was based largely on information produced and shared by the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association based on some surveys they've done of their members. So the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association, a landlord trade group here in Minnesota, they do all kinds of different things, but one of the things that they do is have a pretty good sized membership. I can't remember the number of members that they have, but I remember, I want to say at least 200,000 units that their members are in control of in Minnesota. Just to be clear, there's 600,000 to 700,000 known rentals in Minnesota based on the 2010 census, I think is the information that we have that's the most current. But anyhow, that's still a decent number. And they had asked some percentage, I can't remember what it was, of their membership. How many delinquencies do you have? What's your percentage of delinquencies? And it was somewhere in the 7 to 12% range currently. They have different classes that they ask their members about. Class A would be newer, more expensive properties. Class C was the lowest. It's the oldest rental stock and maybe in the not nicest shape, I guess, would be the polite way to phrase it. Anyhow, it varied depending on what type of property we were talking about, but 7 to 12% was their estimate. This was back in June, the beginning of June. I decided to find some national numbers for today's session. This is a place, the National Multi-Housing Council, that's been cited a lot throughout the media, throughout the country, as this pandemic has gone on. And the question comes up the first of every month, are tenants paying their rent? And so they've been trying to share this information with the media. And you can see here that they're asking a lot of people, over 11 million units surveyed, which is a lot, but it's, you know, a drop in the bucket of how many tenants are in the United States. But it still is something to show us sort of, are tenants paying or not? So we look at June, that's the top numbers on this page. June of 2019 to 2020, there was a 1% drop this year in rent payments being current by tenants. So that's bad news for sure. Nobody wants to see that, but it's not the worst news, and certainly maybe not even the most expected news. I think if we were all looking at this in the future back in March, if we would have asked, hey, what percentage of tenants do we think will be current in June if nobody's allowed to file an eviction for a few months in Minnesota or in other states, 20% would probably have been a pretty generous delinquency rate guess. I think that would have been conservative. People would have thought it would have been higher. But if we look at July, the separation between 2019 and 2020 is almost double that. It's almost 2%. So we're starting to see the lagging impact of the joblessness issue throughout the country. I mean, that's why tenants aren't paying their rent in general. Are there tenants that have the money that are just refusing to pay because there's an eviction moratorium in place? I'm sure there are. But first of all, the eviction moratorium, both at the federal and state level, state that the rent is still due. There's no rent cancellation. There's no rent forgiveness under the law. I guess a tenant could try to argue that, but that's not the law in Minnesota, certainly. And so they owe the rent. And I think from what we're gathering from our clients that call us, and we get about 15,000 calls a year from renters all around the state, that most of them are trying to pay. But there are a lot that can't pay, or they don't have the full amount. So they're wondering, does it make any sense for me to give any of this money to the landlord, or should I hold it all back? So it's just something we're keeping an eye on. And this is a sign that things aren't getting better in the our tenants paying their rent question that we're trying to figure out going forward. Okay, Eric, next slide, please. So Diane Yentl, who's the president of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, gathered, I think this was in late June, a whole bunch of things on Twitter that these were newspaper stories, media reports around the country showing that the eviction wave that we are concerned about in Minnesota. I know landlords are concerned about it. I know tenants are concerned about it. People like our office, where we're tenant advocates, I know the courts are concerned about it. They certainly should be. What is this wave going to look like? So here are the couple of the highlights that she posted from around the country that show that this is not just sort of some doom and gloom, empty threat estimates happening here. So we see in Michigan, they estimate 75,000 evictions will be filed when the moratorium ends. North Carolina has a 9,000 eviction case backlog. Tennessee, 9,000 eviction cases pending in one county. Harris County, Texas, where Houston is, there's over 2,000 evictions scheduled. So those aren't theoretical, those are actually scheduled. And so this is really what's likely to be facing our system whenever evictions are fileable again, is a massive increase in evictions that almost certainly will occur. It's a question of how big the wave will be. Okay, next page, please, Eric. So back to Minnesota. This is the information that I shared a couple weeks ago, but I'll recap it. Again, we have the information from the courts. This isn't information that we found. The information from the courts where a little over 16,000 evictions are filed every year for the last 5 years in Minnesota. Now, not every eviction in Minnesota is about where somebody lives in a rental. There are commercial rentals. A strip mall owner who has a tenant that is not paying their rent will file an eviction just like a residential landlord would file. Also, the foreclosure process, where a bank will effectively take back a property from somebody who hasn't made payments on their single-family home, for instance. The last step in the foreclosure process is to go file an eviction. So that 16,000 a year, 16,000 plus a year, isn't just where people live. We have tried to estimate over time, looking at a lot of records for a lot of different reports that we've run, that about 14,000 non-duplicative, so it's not against the same tenant, residential evictions are filed each year. That's our best guess, and it's an informed guess, but it is a guess. So that's just dividing that, 1,100 plus evictions per month statewide in Minnesota. All right, go on to the next screen, Eric. Thank you. So yeah, the big number here is the one in bold. These are, based on the math that we just showed you, the estimated number of cases that I think are effectively bottled up in Minnesota, 4,665. That's a minimum. That's from a normal year. And we just saw, looking at the national numbers, that rent delinquencies are higher this year by 2% than they were last year. The state equivalent, the Multi-Housing Association survey that I referenced earlier, again, depended on what class of tenancy you were talking about, still had a 2, 3, 4, 5% difference in delinquency payments. So it's reasonable to expect that that 4665 is going to have to go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% because we know about the delinquencies that we faced. So that's our best guess as to the minimum number of cases that we're likely to see filed in Minnesota. But the difference here is they're going to be filed all at once. At least that's how I view this is going to occur. We're in the next slide, which I don't want to go to yet. In the next slide, we're going to talk about whether landlords will actually file. But assuming a good percentage of landlords decide to file an eviction, there's not really any motivation at all to wait to file. If I'm a landlord and I've decided, I've thought about the costs, the benefits of filing, an eviction and I've decided to file, what do I have to gain by waiting? I guess it might be less crowded at the courthouse, but this is going to be done electronically by most landlords, at least at first, and maybe forever at this point. So why would a landlord wait? And that's a fair question. And I think that from my perspective, a tenant advocate, I'm concerned about tenants. I'm also concerned as an attorney, how are courts going to be able to manage this? Because we've never had this kind of massive eviction potential for just a dump of court cases happening all at once. And the courts, first of all, Hennepin and Ramsey County have housing courts, and next week, once again, on Wednesday, we're going to be hearing from Referee Hotelling about how Hennepin County is planning to deal with this. Hennepin and Ramsey County have housing courts that do nothing but housing court cases, mostly evictions. They are the best equipped to figure out how to run a lot of cases, but there's going to be other issues. They're going to be doing them by Zoom, doing them by phone. And they've been doing some of those already because we have that small group of evictions that can be filed. So they've got some practice, which is great for, figuring out how courts are going to run this. But to be able to handle a massive number of cases that happen all at once, then it's going to be problematic. And outside of those core counties where housing courts aren't set up to just deal with eviction cases, they're set up to deal with all court cases. They're going to be suddenly slammed with hundreds, if maybe not thousands of court cases happening pretty much all at once. In some of the counties surrounding Hennepin and Ramsey County, there's going to be hundreds and maybe 1,000 evictions that have been waiting to be filed. And those courts aren't used to that. They simply aren't. And so there's a serious and real concern that these cases will be rushed through. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen. We want to have our courts be places where justice is dispensed, obviously. And there might be defenses that work, the CARES Act being one of them, that should be considered probably until the CARES Act lapses or is essentially nullified by some other legislation that happens at the federal level. By the way, the CARES Act, we don't know what's going to happen with that and the July 25th deadline that's looming. There are all kinds of reports and they're conflicting about whether at the federal level there's going to be an extension of that. And a lot of it is tied to money as well. And here we're not talking billions, we're talking trillions of dollars. And so a lot of moving pieces, but there's a chance that the CARES Act will be extended. We don't know. We'll find out as time goes on. Honestly, it's one of the reasons why we do these presentations on a weekly basis. Things change a lot and they change fast. That's not how I, as a lawyer, am used to working. Generally, laws take months, if not years, to go from formulation to implementation and being actually activated. Now, because of executive orders and really hastily put together legislation for obvious reasons, the rules just change quickly, and we're trying to make sure that everybody on both sides of the landlord-tenant divide are informed about what the rules are, because our view has always been that if there are more people that know what the rules are, they're more likely to follow them. Again, both tenants and landlords. That's why we've given over 200 speeches to landlords around the state. Even though we're a tenant advocacy group, we figure that landlords knowing the rules are better off than ones that are guessing about them. So we try to explain them. Okay, let's go on to that last substantial slide that we have here. So the last question that I'll ask sort of hypothetically and think out loud about for a second is whether landlords will actually file these cases. So as I mentioned, we've done a lot of different reports covering evictions over the last few years, and they're findable online on our website if you want to look at any of them. Some of them are a little dry, I'll be honest, but others offer some information that's pretty surprising in some ways. But one of the things that's fairly consistent is how quickly landlords file evictions in Minnesota. If a tenant hasn't paid their rent, in general, a landlord will file the eviction in the first month usually, or maybe the second month when rent hasn't been paid. They don't wait long. There are outliers. There's a landlord now and again that'll wait 6-10 months before they file an eviction for non-payment of rent, but it's pretty rare. So what we've got right now is we have a whole host of landlords and tenants where the tenant hasn't paid the rent for 4 months. The last time they paid rent was March. They lost their job. They can't afford to pay it. They didn't qualify for the unemployment or didn't get the federal stimulus money, or they just decided not to pay because they don't want to. Okay, so that's who we've got in that group. But we have these landlords that have paused, not on their own choice, but the governor has just said you can't file an eviction. they have been put on pause. They haven't been able to file evictions. So we've got all these landlords that are put into this situation now where whenever evictions doors are opened again, both the Minnesota and the federal level, then landlords are going to have to decide a cost benefit analysis on, do I file an eviction? What do I gain if I file? What are my options? And in my mind, look, I'm not a landlord attorney, I'm a tenant attorney, but I've talked to landlord attorneys my whole career and negotiated with them, and I've talked to landlords. So I have a decent sense what landlords are trying to accomplish here. Landlords are not in the eviction business, clearly. Evictions are loss inducing events for landlords. They almost never get made whole by evictions. It's a necessary evil is how I think most landlords view evictions. And so they don't necessarily gain a profit or a victory by filing an eviction. It's simply maybe their last best choice, depending on the situation that they have. But now, with maybe 4, 5, who knows how many months this is going to be, 6 months of rent backlogged, the landlord is going to have a tougher decision to make, I think, on whether to file an eviction, because if the landlord files the eviction, what they get is the keys. They win possession of the rental. Now, an eviction costs money. They're $300 to file the case. The landlord hires somebody to serve the papers usually, so $75, $100. Depending on where they are in the state and how their business is designed, they might have to have an attorney to file the eviction, which could be another $300, $700. So you're looking at, I don't know, $700 to $1,000 for a landlord to file an eviction in many cases. So will they file that eviction knowing, and by the way, these evictions won't happen immediately. Normally, the court schedules these within 2 weeks of the case being filed, but they don't have to. There's a legislative change that happened during COVID-19 that relaxed all these deadlines that the courts have to comply with. And so the eviction process itself won't be as dependably fast as it used to be. And so in my mind, I think a lot of landlords are likely to go to their tenants that have not paid once we know the day that the eviction doors are open. And they're going to go to that tenant. They're going to say, hey, look, I can file the eviction. Or, what do you have? Do you have some money right now to give me? And just this, those of you that have watched every week, I use $1,000 because the math is easy. The $1,000 is the rent. The tenant hasn't paid for 4 months right now. And the eviction door is open next Tuesday, theoretically. Will the landlord go file? If I'm a landlord, my tenant owes me $1,000, I'm probably going to go to them and say, wow, $4,000. What do you have now? What do you have now? And if the tenant has, I don't know, $1,500, I'm going to probably listen to what their plan is on maybe being able to get caught up. Maybe they just started their job because jobs are restarting here in Minnesota, which is great. So maybe they restarted their jobs. Their income stream looks like it might resume. And maybe instead of them paying $1,000 a month, they could probably swing $1,500 a month going forward. So if they put $1,500 on the table for a $4,000 debt, and then you write up a payment plan where they're agreeing to pay $1,500 on the first of the month for the next 8 months or whatever it is to get caught up, is that worth considering? It's worth considering for sure. Again, if you're in the rental collection business, if you're in the eviction business, no, go file your eviction. But landlords aren't in the eviction business. They're in the rental collection business. So I think it makes sense to at least look at the numbers and talk to the tenant. Right now, a landlord simply has no leverage because you can't file the eviction. That's the one hammer a landlord has against a tenant in Minnesota, is to go file the eviction to collect the rent if they're delinquent on it. And right now you just don't have that in the toolbox, but at some point landlords will have that. And once that hammer is available again, then a landlord can go back to the tenant and say, hey, either pay up or we'll work out a payment plan, or you're going to have to go. And some tenants, by the way, will simply leave to avoid having an eviction on their record, which maybe is better for everybody at that point. But I think it's worth the conversation if I'm the landlord. It might save you filing an eviction just to have the conversation. But the alternative, by the way, if you file the eviction and then chase the tenant for the money, whether it's in small claims court, conciliation court officially, where you can sue up to $15,000, or turn it over to a collection agency, fine. You can do both of those things. Does that mean you'll get the money though? Even if you win the court case, doesn't mean you're going to win the money back, get the money in your pocket. You might get a call 2, 3, 4, 8 years from now where the tenant's trying to buy a house or get a loan for a car. And so you might get a call and they might say, hey, I'll offer you half, and then you'll have a negotiation. That's how these things typically work out. But there's a real chance you'll never see a penny from the tenant again. And landlords that have been in this business long enough know that. And so anyhow, My advice to landlords would be, once you've got the eviction doors open, it's worth that new conversation with the tenant that hasn't been paying forever and maybe has shut off all the lines of communication with you, to say, what can we work out, knowing that you have the ability to go file the eviction, because everybody's footing has changed from a negotiating standpoint at that time from where it was before. Okay, wow, that was a half an hour of me just talking endlessly. Sorry about that. Let's get to some questions here in a second.
Take a drink of water. All right, so yeah, we did get just a couple questions in advance, so we do have plenty of time to take more. If you have any questions about the COVID-19 related rental housing issues and sort of the pending timeline of the emergency order, or anything else related to the situation, or if you just have tenant landlord questions in general. So in advance, Karen asked, tenant is behind 2 months on rent. The tenant's not around. There's warrants out for the tenant's arrest. Can this landlord evict during the pandemic?
So I'm trying to think of how our exception to the evictions would work. Again, and I'll restate this because it wasn't something we covered on the PowerPoint slides today. A landlord currently in Minnesota can't file an eviction for anything except stuff specifically listed in the governor's executive order as exceptions. And the only exceptions there is if the tenant endangers the safety of others on the premises. By the way, that was tweaked 3-4 weeks ago. The governor, the rule used to be if they endangered other residents on the premises, but now it's others on the premises. So that would include the landlord themselves, any employees the landlord has, delivery person, somebody delivering the mail, friends or guests coming by of other tenants. It used to be earlier in the pandemic, just other residents that had to be endangered, but now it's others. So that's one exception. The only other exception is if the tenant violates a specific statute, and I'll give you the statute number, and I'm guessing Eric will post it here because he's really good about that sort of thing. It's Minnesota Statute 504B, as in boy, .171. 504B.171. And that has a list of specific reasons why a landlord can file an eviction, and that's pretty much always been there. Well, not always, since the early 90s. Once again, what's on the list? Illegal drugs. Everything you'd think would be there is there, except for alcohol if you're under 21, in my mind. Illegal weapons, so there's a list of those. Sawed-off shotguns, automatic weapons, if you've been convicted of a felony. Once again, there's a list. If you're engaging in prostitution, if you are possessing stolen property, or if there's domestic abuse in the place. That's it. That's the only exceptions we have. So the question that we got doesn't really let me know about any of those type of exceptions that might apply. A simple warrant for an arrest, I don't think is enough to satisfy either endangering the safety of others or the 504B.171 triggers that we would talk about. By the way, a little bit of trivia that nobody's asking for, but I'll give it to you. If you look up landlord-tenant law in Minnesota, you'll actually find 3 chapters that still get listed. There's 504, 504A, and 504B. So this is really confusing when people look it up the first time. 504 used to be the rules. Actually, both 504 and 566 is where all the landlord-tenant laws, 2 chapters. And then they combined them into one super chapter back around the turn of the century in 2000. And they created 504A. 504A was the first draft, the first pass at the recodified combined stuff. But it was never passed into law, 504A. But it's still on the books because it was passed as a proposed law or something like that. Then 504B was eventually enacted, and that's the official rule. But I will on occasion get a call or an email or a letter from a landlord saying that my client is in violation of 504A, Minnesota Statute 504A, which is a real clear sign that they're not really that familiar with that world. 504A was never the law. So anyhow, a little 504A trivia for anybody that was looking for that. Like I said, I don't think anybody was, but it was in my head. So we'll go on to the nenext question.
All right. Maybe next week we'll have a quiz.
Oh, yeah, I should ask Referee Hotelling about her views on 504A. That'd be a great idea. Try to ambush her with that. Yes.
That would be funny.
Maybe
Okay.
not.
No, probably not. Okay. So then I think this is the same question, maybe. Mick asks, Mick has a tenant that had a stove fire. The tenant called the landlord, and the landlord put the fire out with a fire extinguisher. Now the insurance company is insisting that that the landlord has Service Master, micro clean, plus a new carpet, paint, air conditioning units, and stove. Tenant is not cooperating. What can the landlord do?
So yeah, I mean, and obviously we're hearing just kind of a picture, a snapshot of the situation that Mick has described here. In general, a tenant would be okay with these things being fixed because they'd have a new stove and the new carpet and paint and AC. Obviously, it would be disruptive to the tenant's life, and maybe they figure they can get by with the situation. They don't really need the stove. I'm not sure exactly what's going on. But a landlord in general is allowed to enter a unit to make uh, reasonable repairs. I guess at some point we start to get into a question of whether this is invading the tenant's what's called quiet enjoyment of the premises. Let me give you a more absurd example than what Mick has put in front of us here, which is, and we do deal with this, by the way, where a tenant is living in a place and the landlord has decided they want to sell it. A condo, for instance. So it's a condo, but the owner of the condo is renting it out to somebody else. But they've decided they want to sell the condo, but they really want to rehab the whole thing, just gut it out, so they can make it look beautiful before they put it on the market. So they give the tenant a notice saying, I'm going to come in and I'm going to do room by room. But effectively, for the next 2 months, you're going to be living in a construction zone. Is that legal to do? And we get that question from tenants a lot. And the short answer is probably not, right? I mean, when a tenant pays rent, what they have paid to get is possession of the property. That's really what they have purchased. First day of law school property class, there's a concept called a bundle of sticks. Each stick represents a legal right that an owner of property has. Almost all of us that own any property own some of that bundle. Probably not all of it. You might think you do, but you don't own all of it. For instance, you probably don't own the airspace directly above your home if you own a home, even if you don't have a mortgage. At some point up in the air, you don't own the air. Maybe at some point in the ground, you don't own what's underneath. It depends on how your deed might be formulated. But anyhow, when a tenant rents a place, they are buying one of those sticks for a limited time, the right to possess the place. So the term quiet enjoyment, which is almost never understood correctly because it's confusing. People think that it means there can't be noise in the place. That's not what quiet enjoyment is about. Quiet enjoyment is more accurately described as quiet enjoyment and possession of property or something like that. And that's what it's referring to, is that the title or the possession of the rental property during the lease is the tenant's, not the landlord's. And so, for instance, if a landlord decides to come over and say, where's the rent? And the tenant says, I don't have the rent. And the landlord plops down on the couch and says, I'm not going to leave until I get the rent. The tenant can call the police. This is actually a real case. And the police came out and they said, hey, landlord, you got to go. And the landlord said, no, I don't. I own this place. Police said, no, you're trespassing. I can't trespass on a place that I own, thinking it's some sort of legal impossibility, one of those phrases lawyers love to use. But in fact, yeah, you can trespass on property you own if you've sold the right to possess, which is what almost every landlord sells a tenant in Minnesota. Now, it's sort of a limited right of possession. Landlords are allowed to come in, and there's a whole list of reasons why landlords are allowed to come in, and Eric will put up the the privacy statute in Minnesota on the chat box. But it's not going to give a landlord the power to take over a place. And if this is a really expansive renovation project that Mick is talking about, and that might be what the tenant is upset about, I'm not sure. It might also be that the tenant is upset that Mick is trying to get her to pay for this. If that's true, the question becomes whether she caused the fire irresponsibly. That's the real question. In Minnesota law, a tenant isn't responsible for damages caused by the tenant unless they cause them maliciously, willfully, or irresponsibly. It has to be up to that level, the irresponsible level. And I see that Mick is trying to chime in real time as we're talking about this. And we have a couple minutes, so I don't mind expanding on this, and I'll address a couple of his points in a second. But yeah, that is what it takes for the tenant to be charged for that. Because Mick, there's other people listening and they might wonder, hey, wait a second, when can I charge a tenant for damages that they've caused? Again, it's got to be willful, malicious, or irresponsible conduct causing the damage, or else a landlord can't make a tenant pay for the damage that was caused while the tenant was there. But Mick's follow-up, and I see it here, and Eric, I'll just take it here. He says that the insurance company claims the fire extinguisher mess has created a hazardous environment. So it's mandatory that everything get cleaned up professionally immediately. So this situation is a health risk and hazard. I mean, my advice, Mick, is you start by just being as direct with the tenant as possible on this situation. Might be worth calling the city. This is counterintuitive for a lot of landlords who generally think that the city inspector is only there to give them a list of things to repair, but the city might be able to help convince the tenant that this needs to happen. I guess a creative landlord attorney might say that if she doesn't allow the landlord to come in and make these repairs, that she's endangering the safety of other residents. I guess that's a possibility. So maybe an eviction is theoretically possible here. I certainly haven't seen any evictions filed for anything like that since the pandemic kicked in and the exceptions were created for the pandemic. But it's an interesting kind of theoretical exercise, and I know that doesn't help Mick a lot when he's trying to deal with this in a real world situation, but those are the thoughts that I have top of my head. Again, I would start by telling the tenant and just passing on the information instead of summarizing it. Hey, this is the information I got. This is why it's really dangerous for you. I get why this is an inconvenience. You could offer to put her up in a hotel for a couple nights, depending on how many nights it would take, or if you have another unit available. Make it as palatable for her to live through as possible is one of the things that we'd see a lot of landlords do in that situation going forward.
All right, so let's get rid of those ones. All right, so then Blair has a question. And again, we're done with all the ones that came in advance. So if you have a question, feel free to send it on in. Are there still Blair asks, are there still any known buckets of dollar funding, rental assistance, emergency assistance for tenants who continue to have problems paying rent? Anywhere I'm guessing anywhere a landlord could send them for assistance? Any idea on whether the state is going to pass anything on rental assistance? And so I'm going to put so this is somewhat dependent on location. There is one very good resource in Hennepin County who has put quite a bit of rental assistance forth, and it's fairly easy for tenants to access. So I'm putting that in the chat box. And then we also just today posted the document that we mail out to clients who are facing eviction. That has it's 7 county metro area specific, but it has phone numbers and links to each of the 7 county programs for emergency assistance or rental assistance, some of which are very specific to COVID. For example, I think both Hennepin and Ramsey have COVID emergency specific related funds. So I put that in the chat box. And then lastly, on the question about any idea about if the state is going to pass anything on rental assistance. So that was, from day sort of 1 of this whole thing, there was efforts in the House to pass a $100 million package. That was back in March. And the Senate countered with something like a $30 million rental assistance package. And the Senate bill also included some language about dialing back and actually ending the eviction suspension fairly early. And so there was no agreement back in March or April or May. And there hasn't been in subsequent special sessions that have come forward. So, the question is raised. There's a special session probably coming, or that will be coming on Monday. I'm not sure if the legislature will take that up or not. but we have heard wind that the governor is going to act and take some of the CARES Act funding that came from the federal government that is COVID related directly to the state, which he's already parceled some of that out to counties, and that's why some of the counties like Hennepin already have some rental assistance that they're putting out. But he's also apparently going to potentially at the end of this week or on Monday announce that he's just going to take about anywhere from 50 to 100 million of that CARES Act funding and put it to Minnesota Housing, the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. That's the state department that oversees a lot of the housing, subsidized housing and affordable housing development in the state. And then they have a emergency board meeting today, the Minnesota Housing Board, and they will be considering that and potentially approving an RFP where entities that want to help distribute those resources will be able to do that. So the timeline on that from a practical perspective for tenants and landlords is that potentially by the end of the month or in early August, there potentially will be some additional state funding that's coming through Minnesota Housing and other service providers, and there'll obviously be information coming soon on how tenants can apply for that. And so yeah, the document I put in the chat is a good resource that you can just print if you want to and share with residents to encourage them to reach out to counties. And again, that's only 7-county metro specific, but a good first step for tenants who are facing gaps is their emergency assistance through the county. Anything more, Mike?
No, that covers that pretty well. Looks like we have one more question that popped up.
Okay, and okay, so Linda asks, during the pandemic, my Section 8 voucher was uninterrupted. As a renter, I'm wondering if this might make more landlords more amenable in the future to accepting the Section 8 voucher because it's paid. It's even in a pandemic, it's guaranteed rent, sort of, right?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. First of all, Linda's writing as a tenant, obviously, and this is a session that we devote to landlords and property managers. Landlords frequently watch our Wednesday sessions, which are designed for tenants and social workers as well, but we don't mind. We're sharing information. If you can learn stuff from either one, that's great. And so I'll try to answer Linda's question. And since I don't see any other questions in front of us, I'm going to give a little historical context on my answer here. This type of question has been one that has changed largely with market conditions over my career, at least. I've been doing this work since 1996. And so I've seen a lot of years, bordering on decades at this point, of how landlords treat Section 8 vouchers. Right now, we still have the Minneapolis Section 8 ordinance challenged at the Minnesota Supreme Court. If you remember, I'm not sure how many of you have followed that situation. Minneapolis passed an ordinance saying that Section 8 essentially was a protected class in Minneapolis, that a landlord couldn't turn somebody down simply because they had Section 8. The group of landlords challenged that at the court level. They won the first case at the district court level, but the city won at the Court of Appeals, the state Court of Appeals. That was appealed to the state Supreme Court, who heard the case earlier this year, and we have not seen the decision yet. So we're waiting for that decision about whether or not a landlord can refuse Section 8, at least in Minneapolis, although we've heard from other cities that if Minneapolis's ordinance holds up, that it's likely that other cities would follow with similar ordinances. But this larger question, landlords accepting or not accepting Section 8, again, I've done this a long time, and there was one period in my career where Section 8 was getting calls from landlords regularly, landlords inquiring how to get Section 8 voucher tenants. And I'll tell you when it was. It was about 2002, early 2002, probably through that 2002 into 2003 era. What happened was in 2001, 9/11 happened. And immediately after that, the economic world was in danger of collapsing. I'm not sure how many of you remember that time, how old any of you are watching the show. But if any of you remember, there was a press conference held by President George W. Bush at that time, who implored us all, this was his first major speech after 9/11, implored us all to effectively go out and buy stuff when everything opened up, wanting the economic system to not collapse. It was a little bit, I don't know, a lot of people had a weird reaction to it, but it was an honest concern, is our economy going to collapse? But what we had happen was, after that, the whole economy contracted, just constricted up. And within a couple of months, car dealers noticed that nobody was buying their cars. And they came up with this product, or this loan product that we'd never really seen before, which was 0% interest financing. 0% interest financing hadn't really existed, at least for that level of purchasing with that kind of volume ever in the United States, at least in my lifetime. And so people were trying to figure out an incentive to get people to go buy a car. So the 0% financing. And the interest rate started plummeting for pretty much everything. Anybody that wanted to get a mortgage in the early 80s, for instance, a mortgage, the percent interest on a mortgage payment might have been 18%. And so suddenly we had these mortgage interest rates that were plummeting to 4, maybe even 3%, rates that nobody had seen in their lifetime. So pretty much everybody that could at that point, everybody that could buy a house at that point tried to buy a house. They tried to get help from their family to get a loan, and they tried to go buy a house. So apartments emptied out. The vacancy rate in Minnesota, and certainly in the metro area at that point, had been really low, 1 to 3% for several years, but suddenly it shot up 5, 10, 15%. And at that point, landlords were calling up Section 8 saying, how do I get a Section 8 voucher tenant? And prior to that, they'd been saying, I don't want Section 8. At least some landlords have been saying that. I don't have time to go into all the reasons for that, but they'd been saying that. Right now, Linda's question is first a fair question for today. It's also a fair question for whenever the pandemic gets lifted. I think that landlords are going to be looking at, okay, what's your income source? And a Section 8 voucher holder, well, there's another inspection. There's more paperwork. I get that there's some issues with Section 8 vouchers, but in most of those situations, the bulk of the rent is promised to be paid by whatever your political persuasions are, by probably the best promiser of payment on the planet, Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam's going to pay most of the rent. Whether there's a pandemic or whether they lose their job, the tenant loses their job, you're guaranteed your rent. And so I'm wondering if we might see a similar effect. I also think that there's a real chance that there is going to be an increase in vacancies in rentals in Minnesota in the next few years. First of all, the production of high-end rentals continues. It seems unabated in the last few years. And I also think that there's going to be people that lose their jobs now and move in with family or double up, things like that. And so it's a situation where I think it's worth thinking about. Whether Section 8 will be a more popular option for landlords to actively pursue versus somebody just showing up saying, I have a voucher, will you take it, yes or no, where landlords might be aggressively courting Section 8 voucher holders. That's a possibility, but it is based on something that I've seen in my lifetime where the vacancy rate was dictating this. The market was telling landlords, go after whatever you can get to fill your apartments, and these are good promisers of payment. So anyhow, fair question, Linda, and thanks for asking it, but I see that we're pretty much out of time now. So I wanted to restate next week, Wednesday is when we're having our session, no Thursday session. We, once again, are very enthused about this. Our first outside of our office guest and the head housing court referee in Hennepin County is a great person to hear about how the court system is going to work and your chance to get your questions asked. If you have questions, please sign up early and submit your questions in advance. We always take the pre-submitted questions first. And if we have time to get to the questions submitted throughout the session, that's great. But if not, we'll do the pre-submitted questions first. So please join us for that session.
And I'm putting in the chat just now, I did put the link to the information and link to registration for next Wednesday's session. So go ahead and click that and register if you're interested. And also, as always, you'll get a follow-up email that has a recording of today's session and links to that to other resources such as the registration for next week. So with that, it's after 2:30, so we'll call it a day. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.